Good evening, konbanwa, and annyeonghaseyo.
This is so exciting. Thank you for having me here.
Really excited to be talking to you.
It's so great to join you.
Let me tell you, I am super proud to be here.
I applaud YPFP.
Wonderful folks at YPFP Tokyo.
I want to thank the staff at YPFP.
Byron, Julian, Lauren, Courtney, thanks for setting this up.
I'm very glad to be here.
The timing is rather extraordinary, and what we're confronting is rather extraordinary.
Start me with the big questions.
I will paint a picture with my words.
I must say I am very thrilled to be part of this Northeast Asia Security Symposium.
YPFP Tokyo is proud to host the first Northeast Asia Security Symposium, marking the launch of our new series focusing on security interests and developments within the region and beyond.
This Northeast Asia Security Symposium has been a labor of love, connecting these diverse speakers from incredible backgrounds and bringing them here so that you can learn from them, whether you're a young professional or a seasoned scholar, or just someone who's curious and wants to learn more about security studies. This is the event to be at.
It's really a great pleasure to meet you all and chair for this very important event. As kindly introduced by Byron, I am currently Associate Research Fellow at Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. I specialize in the extended deterrence, and I have been really looking at understanding the US's nuclear strategy, alliance dynamics, and I'm really interested in how we can better retrofit the US's nuclear umbrella and alliance relations in this region. The Northeast Asian region is a very complex area. We see a continued and persistent threats from North Korea. We have an emerging regional hegemonic power, China. And while the region harbors the two key treaty allies of the US, South Korea and Japan, the trilateral relations, which is topic for today, had its ups and downs as the two South Korea and Japan relations became troubled over historical and territorial issues. So with this in mind, I think we have a great plan for today. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you today. The stage is yours.
What I'm going to be talking about are two things. One, what I learned as a Mansfield Fellow, which might be applicable to your careers, as also what I've learned as a foreign commercial service officer. The first one is the importance of showing up. Personal relationships matter, and although it's difficult, pushing to build those personal relationships is critical to your success. Second conclusion is focus on what the host governments need. In any successful relationship, focusing not on what you want, but what the other person needs is the key to success. And then don't assume that the host government policies are rationally thought out, and that the people you're dealing with have the whole picture. And so, the key, I think, a final point is be a source of good information. That's what is the key to being a successful official, is being seen as a honest broker with good information. It's been a real challenge for me as well. I have tried just sending a lot of emails, and occasionally trying to do Zoom sessions or team sessions where we can kind of see each other face to face. I think that helps a little bit. I've actually done a lot of calls in the evening where I sometimes let my dog come in and introduce my dog to the other side, and I hope that helps. I hope it kind of personalizes our interactions. But it really is hard, and I'm hoping to get back to being able to go out and have beer and chicken with people and doing those things, because that's really a important part of being an effective officer.
My experience in the mill-to-mill military dialogue between the United States,
and Democratic People's Republic of Korea, more commonly referred to as North Korea, during the 2018 detente would probably be the most interesting story that I could share from my career up to this point. My then boss, Lieutenant General Bergeson, just asked me out of the blue, Andy, you want to go to North Korea? I found myself sitting amongst the North Korea task force led by then Major General Mike Minihan, who was the United Nations Command and U.S. Forces Korea Chief of Staff. I found myself crossing the MDL, remember the military demarcation line that divides the two Koreas, the line that was crossed by the defector just a year ago, less than a year ago, to go into North Korea to participate in the general officer level talks we held with KPA, or Korean People's Army. To put things into perspective, we haven't been able to hold such general officer level talks with North Korea for close to 9.5 years. So getting the KPA to meet us at this level was a meaningful achievement by its own accord. And after successive rounds of meetings and discussions at the general officer and colonel level talks, the team boarded a U.S. Air Force C-17 jet on the early morning of July 27th, which was the 65th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement. And we flew into Wonsan to receive 55 sets of remains from the North Korean side. The mission Repad 74, I think, was probably one of the most memorable and rewarding experiences of my life up to this point. So although I have a little bit more experience engaging with North Korea than the average person, my comprehension of that country is in fact even far less than the understanding that the blind men had of the elephant in the ancient Indian fable. I mean, due to the strictly closed nature of North Korea, I dare say that the blind men metaphor does apply to even the most experienced hand when it comes to North Korea. So what does all of this mean for those who of us share an interest in Northeast Asia security matters, and especially that regarding North Korea? In my opinion, this means that we need to be extra wary of falling into this trap of strategic narcissism, I mean, coined by Hans Morgenthau and most recently echoed by former National Security Advisor McMaster. Although such self-centric mindset is unproductive when dealing with challenges to national security in all areas, it is even more pertinent when it comes to North Korea due to the strictly controlled and rigid system of governance in that nation. Because when the window opens up, you're given a very brief chance to see a limited portion of that country, and afterwards, it's another long wait until that window opens back up again. But the most fundamental reason why negotiations and talks have failed is due to the lack of trust between us. Well, when I say us, it can broadly refer to the U.S., Republic of Korea, or other Western democracies, and North Korea. And I mean, there's no easy solution, but I think the course of action that we should pursue is, rather than going for the big white elephant in the room, the nuclear issue, we can start by small, low-hanging fruit that don't necessarily undermine the sanctions regime, but at the same time can still build confidence. One such example would be the issue of remains return. Another possible example could be cooperation on public health. Neither of those issues undermine the sanctions regime, but at the same time can and will build trust and confidence between the two sides, something that is in perennial deficit.
My doctoral dissertation explores the evolving geopolitical threat the North Koreans pose onto China. My presentation today will be a brief overview of a subset of my doctoral dissertation, which I will be defending this fall. So you may be confused by the topic of the presentation. Why would North Korea be a nuclear security threat to China? China needs an ideologically similar partner in the region, but it also wants North Korea to be as stable, and also it needs North Korea to be stable and also provide a strategic buffer from the US back to South Korea. And it needs all this while it amasses global superpower. North Korea, on the other hand, needs enough nuclear weapons to guarantee regime survival, and it eventually wants to unify the Korean Peninsula under its own terms. So in terms of shared geopolitical goals, both countries want weakened or at least non-existent US military presence in the region. And this has been more or less the dynamic for the past 70 years. For Kim, the sentiment of anti-사대주의 mentality, 사대주의 translating from in current English to roughly revering the great states, this has been critical to their founding ideology. So North Korea may need China as of now to achieve its operational goals, to achieve sufficient strategic weapons capabilities. But ultimately, I don't think Pyongyang will be a reliable partner for Beijing in the long run. I think North Korea will be an evolving nuclear power that can even threaten China's national security interests in the next perhaps 20 to 30 years. So what does this mean for US warfighters, strategists, and decision makers, partners, and allies? The North Korean nuclear issue is a wicked problem for China, in my opinion, but this is also an opportunity for the United States and its allies. The burden of North Korea's belligerent nuclear ambition needs to be shared with China, but the US cannot lecture China to unilaterally accept American interests on the peninsula. This has clearly failed since six-party talks. First, I think the US media needs to debunk the propagandized rhetoric surrounding Chinese-North Korean relations and underscore its reality for what it is. It's not a blood alliance, it's fundamentally manipulative and testy. Second, the idea of North Korean commitment to Juche and related rejection of great powers to include China needs to be reinforced within Chinese academic circles. And I know this will be challenging because many outspoken Chinese academics and critics of the CCP's North Korean policy have been effectively silenced by Beijing in the past. But I think this is where the US institutions can play a larger role by facilitating these conversations through US-Chinese exchange programs.
For many years, non-nuclear allies in Asia have enjoyed the protection under what is called a nuclear umbrella. Assurances by the United States through bilateral agreements in opposition to confrontational actors. Formalized after World War II and codified in security treaties, the special relationship between Japan and the United States was founded upon the premise of defending Japanese territories under the condition that the empire provide basing rights for US military forces and cease pursuing its own nuclear weapon ambitions. In the decades following, Japan has grown its own forces in strength and scope. With the burgeoning Biden administration, new national leadership in Japan, and increased regional security cooperation among nations, a question persists of what the future holds for the US-Japan nuclear umbrella. And this is research I completed for a soon-to-be published peer-reviewed article in On the Horizon Volume 4 from CSIS. Now, why is this topic important? Well, the consequences of a fully nuclear Japan would alter the nature of its bilateral relationship with the United States, as well as the roles of each nation in the region. Domestic development or acquisition of weapons of mass destruction would lead to a substantial shift in the current Indo-Pacific balance of power, reduce confidence by allies and adversaries in the United States' extended deterrence guarantees, and adverse effects for force projection in Northeast and Southeast Asia. This nuclearization may also drive a desire for parity by historic adversaries, near peers, and neighbors, leading to friction and an increase in arms production and further weaponization by neighbors. That without maintenance, modernization, and administration, including heightened cultural awareness and kinship as allies in the region, the US-Japan nuclear umbrella could become a figurative kasa obake. But what is a kasa obake? A kasa obake is a vengeful spirit or yokai from Japanese folklore that possesses the paper parasol due to disposal or thoughtless abandonment of the umbrella by its owner. I'm using this as an extended metaphor to illustrate how the dissolution or deterioration of a vital defense arrangement would be of ghastly consequence to regional security and our world. Today, the biggest security concerns for Japan include maritime and territorial disputes with a rising China and threats to the mainland from a mounting North Korean nuclear weapons program. Under the US-Japan nuclear umbrella, Japan benefits from a strong security arrangement in proximity to national threats and the ability to maintain anti-militarist norms provided by the complementary arrangement, while the United States receives the advantages of extended force projection, burden sharing, and assurance of regional stability from non-proliferation. Considering the implications for the United States, Japan, and the world writ large, the pros of strengthening the assurances of extended deterrence outweigh the cons, but the present arrangement requires work to uphold.
Happy to talk about nuclear modernization efforts by Pyongyang and challenges for Seoul and Washington. So let me jump right in with a brief state of play. You might be very much familiar with these facts, but nevertheless, North Korea is presumed to have stockpiled fissile material for 20 to 60 nuclear warheads, and is presumably operating more than one warhead design, fusion bomb, at least fusion bombs and boosted fission bombs. And Kim Jong-un reiterated the ambition/plan to build nuclear warheads with lower yields as well as thermonuclear yields. I guess the number one priority right now is ensuring national security during the presidential transition period right now. And then the other medium-term, long-term priority, at least in my thinking, is keeping North Korea among the top priorities for allies, and having the understanding of that threat management or threat containment by the threats or of the threats posed by North Korea is very important and needs to stay among the top priorities, considering also everything that's going on internationally, but also among allies in the expanded fields of cooperation that they are, that strengthening regional deterrence is very important, of course, interoperability, as well as developing ISR capabilities, improving existing ISR capabilities, and sharing information among allies, be it bilaterally or trilaterally. Then also very, very important, keeping those diplomatic off-ramps, as I might call them now, for Pyongyang, while at the same time, of course, ensuring sanctions enforcement, conducting or engaging in non-proliferation efforts in the Indo-Pacific, as well as maybe increasing even more in importance, strengthening cybersecurity.
Now, subject tonight is navigating strategic shocks in Northeast Asia. And the way I want to do it this evening is I'll talk about strategic shocks, and then I'll talk about a brief scene setter for how the strategic shocks have impacted the countries of Northeast Asia. Then I want to focus specifically on some lessons learned, something that can help young professionals in foreign policy engage in these strategic shocks and how to navigate these things, whether they're in policy and think tanks or other lines of work. So strategic shock is an unexpected event that can disrupt existing trends. It makes significant changes to what's going on in the trajectory of world affairs. Not just that, it undermines our facts and assumptions. And those are the facts and assumptions we use to create our policies, our plans, and our strategies. So anybody who's ever done strategic planning, you always start with, what are your facts? What are the things that we know to be true? What are your assumptions, the things that we're assuming going to be true 2 or 3 years from now? And then we develop our ends, ways, and means. Well, a strategic shock upends those things. Your facts no longer are your facts, and your assumptions may not be your assumptions anymore. A strategic shock has the potential to derail whole countries from their current course. And as with most strategic shocks, they create uncertainty, and that uncertainty can lead to fear and crisis. This is why it's so important for governments and for professionals in foreign policy to be able to help create flexible and practical solutions to strategic shocks. COVID-19 impacted the world greatly, and it changed our trajectory. So it's a textbook definition of a strategic shock. But we also had one most recently with Russia's invasion of Ukraine just a little over a month ago. But let's look at the impacts, because it's not just the invasion of Ukraine and the wanton aggression against the Ukrainian people that's going on right now. We have this massive humanitarian crisis with nearly 10 million displaced people. We have countries that are exacting sanctions, removing most favored nation clauses from their relationship with Russia. We have food insecurity issues, Ukraine and Russia being the breadbasket for many countries throughout the world. We have countries that are rethinking their individual and their collective security institutions. So where do those strategic shocks leave us in assessing the state of play here in Northeast Asia? So we'll look first at China. China finds itself in a position that it does not like to be in right now, and that's in reaction mode. The authoritarian system of governance in China under the Chinese Communist Party privileges institutional stability because that's how they have to be able to implement their policies. They are a big country with a lot of organizations, a lot of moving parts. Any time of uncertainty or instability in the world is something that's going to be very difficult for them to react to. And so now they're in reaction mode of what they're going to do about Russia and how they're going to respond to this global crisis that Russia has created with its invasion of Ukraine. And they have to rethink their relationship inside the international community and how they approach the rules-based international order. You see, they have some key questions they have to answer right now. Are they going to be that safety net for Russia if Russia needs support economically? What does that mean for China in the international community's eyes? The second question there is, what does it mean for China's revisionist prospects? You know, they see how the world has reacted. 141 countries condemning Russia in the UN General Assembly, the sanctions that have been exacted against Russia. What does that mean for China in terms of what it's trying to do? And then that final question there, how is the international community going to adjust its approach to China? Of course, after we talk about China, we have to look at Taiwan, because when we talk about China's revisionist ambitions, Taiwan is usually what comes to people's minds first. What lesson can they learn from Ukraine? Well, Taiwan would assuredly be, reassured by the fact that the international community responded so strongly to Russia. That example does not translate perfectly to Taiwan because of its diplomatic status with other countries throughout the world. Only 13 of the 193 member states maintain formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And many of those member states have major economic relationships with China. And for them, the key question is, of course, will China invade? Taiwan's got to think about that question. And certainly, as foreign policy thinkers, many of you all are already thinking about that question in your own lines of work. What this does is it leads to a balancing act for Taiwan, though. So they need to reduce their diplomatic vulnerabilities, but when they do so, they need to avoid any actions that may trigger a militarized response. Next, we turn to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I include this because the impact of COVID-19 has probably been stronger on DPRK than any other country in Northeast Asia. The other strategic shock that we need to talk about, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And for the DPRK, there's two lessons that are not learned, but reinforced, both in the Ukraine example and the Russia example. Ukraine example tells the DPRK that if you're a country that's willing to sign away your right to nuclear weapons, that you may be invaded one day. The Russia example is a very important one here, because what it tells the DPRK is that if you are a nuclear power and you engage in acts of aggression, there's a threshold, and that countries that may be economically or militarily superior to you will not attack you if you have nuclear weapons. And so what we should expect from the DPRK is what they've already been doing, and they've signaled in the 8th Party Congress last year. They provided a menu of weapons development. Let's turn then to the South, the Republic of Korea. There was a major event that took place during the course of this, and that was on 9 March with the presidential election. That it demonstrated the strength of ROC democracy. Now we have a new president-elect. And the question is, how will the president-elect Yoon Suk-yeol leverage the Republic of Korea's pretty massive instruments of power on the global stage? Now, Japan, speaking the rules-based international order, has demonstrated its leadership. Now, we've seen it in steady state peacetime with the quote-unquote free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. But we've also seen Japan's leadership in response to crisis and war now with what they've done after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They did that at the expense of their own policy. What we're going to see now is Japan rethink how it's going to approach Russia, and it's going to codify that in the national security strategy and the National Defense Program guidelines that are going to be published at some point this year. Next, we turn to the United States. It's got 75,000 troops deployed in Japan and the Republic of Korea, major interests in that region. So you can't really talk about Northeast Asia without talking about the United States. I would dispel any questions or concerns about this whole, how's it going to affect the Asia pivot? For the United States, really what this has told them is that the rules-based international order has become even more necessary. So it's important to build this coalition, these groups of countries that are going to reinforce the rules and stick together in times of crisis. And so for US, what that really means is finally completing that wheel around the hub and spokes. And what I mean by hub and spokes, you can see that picture on the lower right, the US having bilateral relations with countries throughout the region, trying to make that a multilateral relationship where all these countries can work together in response to major crises or contingencies. I just want to talk about how we help navigate these shocks as young professionals in foreign policy. You see, as young professionals in foreign policy, you guys have a very important role in shaping that policy. Now, the two things that you can bring to the table that is most important is knowledge and an understanding of when and how to make that knowledge accessible to others. Don't assume that anybody knows anything that you know. Start from zero and let them tell you what they know. So to do that, the really two most important questions you have to be able to answer are why and how. Use the evidence and knowledge that you have available to you to diagnose the why. And when you do that, you can assess which of those options are most likely. You have to understand that policy means nothing if it's not implementable. So the question is, how do good ideas get put into action? And that's really the thing that separates pundits from policy professionals. So your greatest value as a policy professional is to have an intimate understanding of the mechanics of policy formation and implementation. Your job as foreign policy professionals is to get as much evidence and information as possible. That's what we all do. All of us in our daily lives, when we're working in this line of work, whether it's you're trying to support an NGO or to do humanitarian relief, or you're trying to prevent a war from happening, you are trying to find out everything that you can and to provide a prism through which to explain this information so that a senior decision maker can look at the problem set and has this prism to understand what they're saying. What's the risks with all of the different potential outcomes that could have and all the options that you're going to give? What are your facts and your assumptions? What are the things that you know are true, that you absolutely know are true? And what are the things that you're saying, well, I believe this is true. I can't 100% say this, but I believe that this is what I'm basing my decisions off of, is that we're assuming that this aspect is true. So facts and assumptions. Invariably, you're going to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. What you have to do is just be able to adapt quickly, because life is nothing but just a series of problems. When you make a mistake, the natural instinct is to want to get down on yourself and to say, oh my God, the world is over. But the best people find a way to push through. And there's an awesome quote that I love, and I'll end with this quote. It's from Ulysses S. Grant. And he said, there comes a time in every battle when both sides consider themselves beaten. Then he who continues the attack wins. You see, the challenges that you're facing on your side, the other side is facing too. They may not just show it, but they're going through the same consternation and struggles that you're going through. You just need to know that when you feel like you're defeated, sometimes the best thing you can do is just continue the attack.
I think we're just so lucky to spend a little time this evening to discuss some important issues about the state and the future of Northeast Asian security. And we're really fortunate to dialogue with these experts and practitioners from different disciplines to examine Japan and South Korea. And hopefully we can leave today's discussion with a better understanding of this trilateral relationship with the US and areas we should focus on going forward.
I think the US-Japan alliance is now getting back to its origin. And when the US-Japan alliance was formed back in 1952, the structure of the alliance itself was very much asymmetric. The Japan provided the basis for the US forces, while the US provided forces for the protection of Japan. But although the structure was asymmetric, the US-Japan alliance was very much equal, because both sides could get massive benefits. The United States provided the offensive capabilities, while Japan provided defensive capabilities. And by combining both Japanese and American capabilities in this region, we basically contained the Soviet Navy within the Sea of Japan. And this reality actually helped end the Cold War. So after the Cold War, the US-Japan alliance faced regional security challenges in Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait. The rise of China is definitely a long-term challenge. And more recently, we have witnessed further partnerships between China and Russia. So the combination of China's rising power and Russia's disruptive power in this region would pose a grave threat to the US-Japan alliance. And I think the Japanese government will enhance our conventional capabilities to enhance the credibility of US extended deterrence. In some sense, the demography might be the number one challenge for Japan's security policy. Every year, we have about, less than 1 million newborn babies in Japan. But our current self-defense force recruit system expects 10,000 people will join the self-defense force every year. So 1 out of 100 of newborn babies needs to join the self-defense force at a certain point, which is not a realistic calculation. So we have to deal with this issue. So one thing, one solution is technology. By using the technology, we can reduce the number of personnel necessary to operate our platforms.
What we see in front of us right now are parallels between today and the global dynamic that existed on the eve of World War II. Threats by Russia to use nuclear weapons to deter the West. Second, interpretations of state sovereignty are being challenged again. And then third, states' legitimacy within the international order is once again open for interpretation. And nowhere are these concepts, nuclear weapons, sovereignty, state legitimacy, more relevant than Northeast Asia, which is home to 3 nuclear power states, the cockpit of great power conflict, to borrow a phrase from Aaron Friedberg. Speaking to modern history, about every 30 to 50 years, on average, a major systemic crisis occurs in the world. The coexistence of 2 separate Koreas has settled into the normative acceptance within the international system's psyche. And because of this, the question over Korean legitimacy remains caught in this state-on-state rivalry where survival and security are always on the line, and the battle for legitimacy, Korean legitimacy specifically, continues. North and South Korea have pursued separate lines of legitimacy in a competitive yet highly asymmetrical way. South Korea, economic powerhouse, responsible actor in conformity with the current international order. ROC military has advanced. The country's security is premised on a very robust U.S. ROC defense treaty, arguably one of the finest treaties that there's only 7 in the U.S. and Japan, U.S., Korea is 2 of the greatest. And North Korea, on the other hand, weak economy, with a GDP just under Afghanistan's. It's isolated as a country, and while it depends on support from China and Russia, maybe to a lesser degree, these are not robust alliances in the same sense that the US ROC alliance is. North Korea's strategy for seeking legitimacy is essentially its nuclear program. The North Korean nuclear program, it's not just about surviving, it's survive and thrive. Nuclear weapons also gives North Korea de facto nuclear state status. This is status. So, and this status makes countries react. It makes the United States react. It arms North Korea with a capability that could, depending on how international conditions evolve, it could compel South Korea. So in the rational mind of Kim Jong-un, nuclear weapons not only guarantees survival of the regime, but also creates a possible path, conditions permitting, to achieving total sovereignty of the Korean Peninsula. Expect North Korea to continue leveraging its nuclear program into strategies that fall within that acceptable range of outcomes that guarantee survival and security at a minimum. The problem with, North Korea is just such an opaque system that it's really hard to peer in there and figure out how it affects the domestic scene. But what we can probably be sure of is that it's a motivator. It's frankly, it's a source of pride for the regime, and it can be used, as a coalescing mechanism.
There's so many exciting things happening today, to include challenges, but mostly opportunities. In many cases, a lot of the technology innovations that are happening that apply to this region right now are rooted in the history of this region. And that helps shape where we are today and where I think we can and should go tomorrow. But let's start by looking back in history a little ways in some early innovation in this region that drove an empire to dominance. First, let's look at the Zero fighter. At the time of its development and at the start of World War II, this was an incredibly capable and lethal air power machine. It was among the most maneuverable and fastest fighters of the time. And at the start of World War II, it could outmaneuver nearly any adversary fighter. But those Zero fighters, combined with the aircraft carriers that were developed by the empire, another amazing innovation, in many ways changed power projection worldwide. Despite the amazing technology that Japan developed in the many years prior to the war, once it commenced, Japan actually failed to innovate at the speed of the US and allies. By the end of the war, they were using most of the same technologies that they started with, while the US had tapped its vast resources to outpace them and develop better technologies, tactics, and weaponry. However, the Northeast Asia region, they have been a powerhouse in the standpoint of other technologies. So I highlight some of these non-defense, non-security related innovations because moving forward, I think they may be the key to Japan and Korea's contributions to regional security. One, in Korea, they have their own domestic information sharing data link in development, which is called Link K. Japan has developed their own rather capable C-2 airlift aircraft. And more than just an airlift role, they are also currently developing it for potential other uses as a multi-use large aircraft. Both countries are in stages of development of their own fighter jets. In Korea's case, the KF-21, and in Japan's, the FX or Future Fighter program. Both our Japanese and Korean counterparts are also making advancements in non-traditional military domains, namely space, cyber, and electronic warfare. In the future battlefield, dominance in these arenas will prove crucial. Our alliance leaders and our foreign policy professionals must be thinking of how we can move faster and more effectively. What I would like to see is for Japan and South Korea to look inwards at what they do best and see how that might apply within the defense and security realm. Korea and Japan boast the fastest internet speeds in the world. Why not apply them to defense and security? Next up, Family Mart, or really any Japanese convenience store. These companies, Family Mart, Lawson, 7-Eleven, have mastered a logistics infrastructure to place massive amounts of fresh food and goods across the country, minimizing individual store inventories while somehow still meeting literally every human need, and all at a ridiculously affordable cost. So how does this apply to defense? We have teams working daily on how to best disperse and sustain forces to as many locations as possible, allowing them to be able to move quickly between locations and build them the minimum possible for movement, but most effective logistics chain for lethality. I'd argue in a lot of ways, Family Mart has this figured out. So why don't we give them a call? And finally, K-pop. K-pop is a tremendous example of a global influence operation that has achieved massive power and success. They have won the hearts and minds of fans all across the world. Further, K-pop is a superb example of international collaboration and cooperation. Exactly what we want to get at in the defense realm. Let's imagine if you could take this K-pop formula and apply it to security influence operations. Just think, a K-pop-like powerhouse across the entirety of the Asia Pacific, working with smaller, developing partners. But rather than winning TikTok fans, it's focused on winning over populations and decision makers to the ideals of freedom, democracy, and openness. The next game-changing technologies are not going to be those that simply improve on past technologies. The next major defense innovation is not going to be the next tank or bomber jet, as important as those things might be. So I can't say what tomorrow's major game-changing innovation will be. I do think that Japan and South Korea, in concert with the US and other like-minded partners, are very well suited to develop and contribute immensely to that next 0-1 defense and security innovation that will help continue the openness and prosperity that we see and further improve it here in the Asia Pacific region. Absolutely, I do. And in many ways, I think that conflict is ongoing today. Our own Defense Department, the Japanese Ministry of Defense and South Korean Ministry of Defense are probed and attacked daily. And they've had to develop their own defense forces to stand up against these attacks. Furthermore, when it comes to the rise of disinformation, weaponization of social media, these are all things that absolutely pose threats and could, if used in I won't say the right manner, if used in the wrong manner, could undermine and bring down and topple regimes.
We can't get away from a foreign policy discussion without inserting some sort of military philosophy. So that being said, why is this important? Because to know the enemy and know yourself, you'll never be defeated. However, if you're ignorant of your enemy, but you know yourself, then maybe you'll win, but you might lose too. And if you don't know either, then you're pretty much done for. We're trying to renew our enduring advantage. And what is that enduring advantage? It's our alliances. And the goal is that we want to be able to meet the challenges from a position of strength. So alliances and partnerships, really, we can't do this alone. We have to have the US ROK, the US Japan, US Australia. What got brought up earlier was the Quad. We can't do any of actual security cooperation without partners, and then we can't maintain the free and open Indo-Pacific and the rules-based international order without our allies. So how do we do this? Well, currently, so I'll offer the Air Force perspective, and we got to hear from a couple of folks in these areas already. Security cooperation officers, that's like your foreign military cells, those sorts of things. Air attaché, assistant air attachés. Those are your folks in the embassy advising. Foreign area officers is a little more all-encompassing. Those are our folks in headquarters. Those are the regional experts. And then we have the Air Force Culture and Language Center that focuses on language, regional expertise, and culture. And that also includes our kind of language-enabled airmen. And then we have overseas education, ODE, Olmsted, Mansfield. These programs that help us go out and learn from our allies. In today's world, we have neoliberal-centric international organizations that most democratic nations participate in, and then many of our adversaries also participate in. But what we're saying here is that there's still a neo-realism undertone where our adversaries are trying to change the international order to suit their needs. When we get to a point where the international order no longer is beneficial and the risk outweighs the cost of continued participation, we see what we see currently in the Russo-Ukraine conflict. And that is essentially President Putin had assessed that the international order was no longer in his favor, to the point that he would put his country at risk to impact and change that international order into his favor. I feel like most of our US policies are very capabilities centric. We look at this and we go, how do I defeat that capability? And that's a very important discussion, but it's limited to ways and means. And we don't ever really take and look at the ends and what is the end game. And that's what we're trying to do with strategic, counter-strategic thought. I need to understand my enemy, my adversary, right? So understanding the tenets of the PRC's national strategy is absolutely essential to the future course of what China will do, security-wise, military-wise, politically. If we don't understand that, it's very hard to have a counter-strategic thought process and innovate strategies that help prevent China or the PRC from getting to their desired end state and keeping the status quo in our favor. Counter-strategic thought, though, is a soft power focus. It's not focused on what bomb is going to do the most damage. It is all soft, fuzzy thought. It includes language, includes culture, includes an understanding of things historical. It includes an understanding of things territorial. And then mostly what we have to do is start to understand them ideologically. We don't understand what drives our adversary. It is extremely difficult to counter their strategy. Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, Chris. The Thucydides trap, to me, a lot of people like to limit that to global powers. Arguably, when Thucydides came up with, like when we came up with these theories and this philosophy of, you know, great powers at some point trip up over themselves and create problems and then go to war and then end up no longer being great powers. That was all regionally based, right? Arguably, either one could be a Thucydides trap. I think the greater one with the greater risk to the international order is the US-China trap. Could the China-India, I don't know that it's a big trap so much as it may increase regional instability. And then India being a member of the Quad, and arguably it's kind of hard to know where India lies because they've got agreements with Russia, but then they're not friends with China, but then they're friends with us. It's very unique. That could potentially complicate our own US-China Thucydides trap. So I don't know that there's a good answer. That's purely speculation on my part. So hopefully it just gives you something to think about.
So as young professionals in foreign policy, all the participants should walk away with this wisdom from our panelists to dive deeper into some of these issues, into these topics, and continue to engage in substantive research, service, work, etc. I love that. I'd say, you know, continue to use your networks to connect with folks that might expand your circle of acquaintances, colleagues, and friends. So I think this is a really great group of folks in the Japan team, and I think they're putting on great programming. So all the more reason to develop that skill of networking and reaching out to folks, because you never know, they might prove helpful, insightful in your professional journey when you soon become a decision maker